Today's lecture is on cultural capital, a concept made famous and most commonly associated with the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Of all the kinds of capital that academics talk about, cultural capital is probably the most complex and least well conceptualized. Two other kinds that Bourdieu also talked about that are perhaps more intuitive are economic capital, which typically refers to the financial resources we have available to us, often for the purposes of investment, and social capital, which refers to the resources associated with our social networks. For instance, people who have a lot of social capital may have people in their lives who can provide them with emotional support. Others have the contacts they need who can open doorways in the world of employment and opportunity. Furthermore, these two forms of capital can easily be intertwined. For instance, having a lot of economic resources can earn one entrance into the social clubs of the elite, who can then grant one favors in the future. Or in the reverse direction, having wealthy friends may mean being able to benefit indirectly or sometimes directly from their wealth. If we have these two forms of capital, in addition to cultural capital, this begs the question, what does capital actually mean? Although a common definition of capital in sociology comes from Karl Marx and is intertwined with the concept of labor, is there a definition that is less convoluted for students who don't necessarily have the time and resources to dive deeply into a discussion about economics, labor, capitalism, and private property ownership? For the more restricted purposes of a course on culture, let us provide here a relatively simpler definition of capital that can help us understand what ties together both these concepts of economic and social capital, as well as the cultural capital that is the focus of today's lecture. For the purposes of this lecture, let's think of capital as the assets that people have in their possession that can be used as resources to help them gain an upper hand in society. In this way, economic capital refers to the financial assets that people often use to generate more financial wealth. Social capital refers to the assets associated with social networks that people use to get ahead in life, whether that means calling in a favor, however defined, having access to emotional support and resources, or having a network through which useful knowledge of social opportunities, including job opportunities, can reach us. So turning back to our main concept in this lecture, cultural capital can be thought of as the distinctive cultural skills, tastes, mannerisms, material belongings, styles of life, attitudes, traits, and other assets that can be used as resources to gain advantage in society. That is obviously a mouthful, and on its own perhaps too convoluted to be of much intuitive use. So let's break it down a bit more. Bourdieu talked about three forms of cultural capital: embodied, objectified, and institutionalized. Bourdieu calls embodied cultural capital long-lasting dispositions of the mind and body. What makes them embodied, in other words, is that they are present within our personal selves, whether physically or mentally. And because they are cultural, these dispositions are considered as capital because they are culturally valuable. As an example, some of us may learn second languages because they give us better appreciation of other cultures, help us to navigate cultural settings a little better, make international and intercultural business possible, allow us to communicate with a diverse body of people more effectively, and so on. One might therefore also call embodied cultural capital a form of cultural competence that we develop within ourselves. Since language is just one part of culture, there are certainly many other examples of embodied cultural competence, including knowledge of and ability to adhere to social norms in business settings. But embodied cultural capital doesn't just appear in situations of intercultural interaction. Skills that are culturally valuable, such as construction or computer literacy, can also be thought of as capital that is embodied. What are some common characteristics of embodied cultural capital? First, as the term embodied implies, this form of capital is tied to the individual, which means just like developing a suntan or muscular body through working out, as Bourdieu points out, we cannot develop embodied cultural capital secondhand through other people's efforts. This also means that these cultural competencies or dispositions typically take time to develop. In fact, that is what school is. It teaches us skills and knowledge over a span of years that presumably will help us either to get jobs or just to navigate the social world more effectively. The opposite of this is what we have sometimes seen in sci-fi movies, where various skills can be directly downloaded into our minds and bodies. Perhaps that will one day be on the horizon, but not just yet. In addition, because embodied cultural capital is tied to the individual, this means that unlike something like economic capital that can be passed down to one's offspring, Embodied cultural capital, in contrast, dies with its bearer, as Bourdieu says. You can imbue others with your embodied cultural capital through teaching and training, but what that person learns and develops then becomes uniquely theirs, not yours. Secondly, embodied cultural capital only matters or only becomes capital that can give us an edge, in other words, when it is in limited supply. For instance, literacy only helps one get ahead if not everyone else can read. This makes one eligible for jobs and honors that will be withheld from those who can't read. However, in a world or country or social setting where everyone can read, your literacy no longer gives you an edge. At best, all it does is equalize the playing field, at least with regard to literacy. Finally, although there are several ways in which we can develop embodied cultural capital, Bourdieu was especially interested in how it is often transmitted from families to their children. In other words, growing up in a family with certain cultural competencies often causes, or at least makes it much easier, for children in those situations to develop those skills almost subconsciously over time. For example, I grew up in a country where most children did not speak English at home. My family was one of the rarer ones that did. This turned out to be a huge advantage for a number of reasons. One, it helped me to do better at English classes at school, obviously. Two, it earned me more attention and I would say even respect from some of my teachers because they highly valued English competence. Three, it made me feel more confident later in life at articulating my thoughts, for instance in college classes in the US, even though I came from a culture where students were not expected to contribute their own independent and creative thoughts in class. Next we have objectified cultural capital. Objectified cultural capital, in contrast, is not connected with our person but rather takes form as cultural goods, which includes material objects and forms of media, including writings, paintings, monuments, instruments, and so on. Again, like embodied cultural capital, these cultural goods have cultural value to them, particularly those that we hold in high regard. For instance, writings by Shakespeare, paintings by Da Vinci or Monet, monuments that hold much cultural and historical significance such as Mount Rushmore, the Lincoln Memorial, or the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. One key way in which objectified cultural capital is related to embodied cultural capital is that the former requires the latter in order to be fully utilized as capital. For instance, take an expensive and famous painting that costs millions of dollars, such as those sold at auction houses in places like New York City. While one obviously has to be rich to own it, if one has no idea of its cultural significance and if one lacks the language and knowledge by which to quote-unquote properly appreciate it, as art aficionados do, one would swiftly be mocked out of existence in certain social circles, specifically in social circles where the people involved do have the embodied cultural capital to quote-unquote properly appreciate the piece of art. Or take this example. Around 2015, I visited a wine store in New Zealand that allowed you to sample from dozens of wines using a single card that could then be charged to your credit card. As someone who enjoys wine but isn't extremely well versed in wine appreciation, I picked this wine for fun, a 2013 Penfolds Grange Shiraz, an Australian wine, because it was the most expensive bottle of wine that was available for tasting, $1,099.99 to be precise. What you see in that glass is 25 milliliters, about 4/5 of an ounce, or the equivalent of 4 quarters stacked on top of each other. That volume of wine cost me $35, and to be honest, it was fine. It tasted no different to me than a $30 or $40 bottle of wine. Yes, when it comes to wine, price isn't a completely accurate barometer of quality, but I bet someone with more familiarity with wine, with the embodied cultural capital for wining and dining in other words, would have gotten far more out of the experience than me. Finally, institutionalized cultural capital is also objectified, but in the form of academic qualifications that have, as the name suggests, institutional recognition. In other words, institutionalized cultural capital most commonly takes the form of educational degrees that, beyond being a symbolic marker of the completion of one's education at a certain level, is then accepted by other institutions, typically workplaces, as a marker of competence to conduct the tasks required of a given job. Institutionalized cultural capital enables two kinds of things. First, it allows for comparisons between people based on qualifications. The most common place in which we see such comparisons being made is when applying for jobs that require certain academic degrees. For instance, those that only allow those with a bachelor's or master's degree to apply for a certain job. Second, They also therefore allow for the cost both of degrees and wages to be determined. In other words, by distinguishing, say, between a bachelor's and a master's degree, universities can determine how much and how differently they are going to charge students seeking to get one or the other. On the tail end of getting your degree, workplaces are also able to determine how much to pay a prospective employee. For instance, people hoping to get into academia might apply for academic positions right out of grad school. Because deadlines happen almost a year before the start of these positions, it is very likely that applicants fresh out of grad school won't have completed their dissertations yet. As such, it is possible, and it occasionally happens, that a very promising candidate gets offered a job even when they haven't completed their degree yet. Should their employment begin before they have finished, for instance before they have defended their dissertation in front of a committee, they likely will be paid at a lower wage until they have completely and successfully defended and received their degree, after which they will receive a promotion in wages. In this lecture, we have talked about various forms of capital. We began by briefly listing down the more commonly recognized forms of capital, economic and social. Whereas the first is associated most directly with finances, the second is associated with our social ties. Then we focused on cultural capital and discussed three of its respective forms: embodied, which pertains to people's individual cultural competencies; objectified, which refers to the cultural objects themselves; and institutionalized, which takes the form of academic qualifications.